Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast. Are you doing the best for your client to help them create their legacy? Are you creating a plan that goes far beyond finances to help people ensure that it becomes the driving force behind all decisions? On this podcast, hosts Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller will help you with growing your practice and your clients' peace of mind. Together, they bring the best and brightest minds to share with you how to help your clients develop their best legacy. And now, here are your hosts, Katie Beth and Stan.
Welcome back to the Legacy Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Katie Beth Hand, and my guest today is attorney and legacy expert, Jay Barrett. Jay, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to have you on the show today.
Oh, it's good to be here.
Absolutely. So before we dive in, tell our listeners a little bit about your background. You've had kind of a unique career path. So tell us about that and what eventually led you to kind of where you are and what you're doing today.
Yeah, it is a bit of a strange path, like 4 different careers I've had. So I started out, believe it or not, in the Navy as a nuclear field electronics technician, which landed me on a submarine for a while and then on an aircraft carrier. Didn't make a career out of that. Thought I'd become a real estate tycoon and got out of the Navy. The real estate thing didn't pan out either. So just by dumb luck, took a test to see if I had the aptitude to be an air traffic controller, which I passed, and didn't know anything about airplanes, notwithstanding the fact that I was on an aircraft carrier. I was in the bottom of the ship, never
Right.
really knew anything about the airplanes. But yeah, so spent 30 years as an air traffic controller. During that time, our union, called NACA, I became a labor relations advocate for the union and got interested in doing grievance handling, that kind of stuff, arbitration, which, led me to meet a bunch of arbitrators, that kind of thing, and eventually go to law school. So, decided that that was a good idea with 2 kids and a wife and everything else to go to law school during the day and vector airplanes at night. And around 2010, I graduated from the University of Miami and opened my part-time state planning practice in South Florida. But recently, about 5 years ago, decided that I wanted to transition and do this full time. Retired from the FAA and, stumbled upon you legacy leaders folks. Met Stan from Wealth Council and a lot of the other founders, way back in the day. And I really, really enjoyed that community for sure. They were a huge help. And a lot of the same thinking, right? The thought processes, the way to handle or help clients has aligns with my interests. So that's yeah, why I'm here.
I love it. No, great answer. So, for those who may not know, tell us a little bit about the types of services your law firm provides. And then, kind of on a personal note, after graduating from law school, what is it that really drew you to estate planning in particular?
Oh, that's funny. I really enjoyed the trust and estate class in law school. I don't know why. It's just, you pick out like one thing that you liked in law school. And then also when I graduated, I still had like 8 years to go before I could retire from the FAA. And so I wanted to do something that kept me out of court, right? So estate planning seemed like a really good fit for me. Not only, and I loved like, property law also. And contracts. And so all of those things fit well for me. And it was just a good glove for me. It just fit. And as far as why I moved in that direction and stayed there, I had people that like were like, you meet people all the time that don't have any planning. And it was a way for me to help folks. And I had made myself a promise that when I graduated, I wasn't going to do any ambulance chasing, so no personal injury law. I was going to stay out of the divorce and adversarial type of law. And, so this was a good fit for me. It was happy law. I like to think of it as happy law.
Happy, helpful law. Absolutely. I
Exactly.
love that. I love that. So, tell us a little bit about what type of client are you best suited to serve? If you have a typical client, what does that look like?
No, I absolutely do. My quote unquote avatar client are like retired military folks who and they don't have to necessarily have been retired from the military, but that age group, right? So, late 40s, mid 50s, maybe even in their 60s or whatever, that, their kids are grown, they've got some assets, but they haven't really thought about how to protect not only their assets, but they might start, you know, in the back of their mind wondering, what about my legacy? What am I doing about, passing on my thoughts and my life? How do I preserve what I've done and make sure that, my grandkids have something or whatever? So those kind of folks, I find them. I live now in the, Arlington, Virginia area, which is just outside the Beltway, or actually I'm inside the Beltway, but just outside DC. And there's a lot of those folks around here, right? So, and they don't do planning because, it's hard, right? People love to procrastinate. I mean, they don't love to, they just do.
Right. Right. No, I agree with that. And on our end, because we're in the estate planning world as well, I think it's one of those nobody likes to think about death, the end, all of those things. And of course, when you're the whole reason you go through the planning process is so that one day when something happens to you, there's a plan. And people don't want to really think about that, whether they're in their 40s or their 50s, or we have clients in their 60s, 70s, 80s that come in that have never made a plan because they just didn't want to have to think through that piece, but we know it's going to happen to all of us. And so better to have a plan than to not have a plan. But I love that. Tell us a little bit about how sort of this idea of legacy, you're a member of the Legacy Leaders Network, and there's another network we'll talk about in a minute that you're a part of. What is it about the legacy piece of things that really interests you, and why do you feel like that's an important part of the planning process on top of just having legal documents?
So, just a quick little story about it. So, I'm adopted, and just recently, about a year ago, actually found my biological mother. And I had adoption paperwork, and that's all I had to go on. And it had my birth name on it, which was Szymanski. And so, didn't know nothing about it other than that sounded like a Polish name or whatever. But when I found my biological mother, I was like, okay, so, tell me about the family, right? I was very like interested in, when did we come from Europe and how long have we been here? And she knew, her dad and she knew her grandfather, but she didn't have a lot
Mm,
of background information on them. She like, she didn't even know what part of Poland they emigrated from. And like that to me was just a shame, right? So like the legacy part to me is passing down those types of that information. Like, when did the people in your family come to Ellis Island, or from what part of Europe or wherever did you come from, and how did you get here, and how did you pull yourself up from your bootstraps, and what business did you go into, and how did you make it here, and what languages did you speak, and were you in the military, and that all of it matters, right? I mean, I'm
right.
curious.
Right.
And I don't know. And I think deep down, I think everybody is really, you know,
Right. Yeah, it's
up and
so interesting, and every family just, people may even think that their family history is not that exciting, but to these younger generations who didn't experience it, having a way to have those stories or those family heirlooms, like those, knowing where your family actually came from and what drew them to come to this country and when they came, a lot of that stuff for those generations that get further and further removed, being able to have those connections really kind of provides a sense of belonging and a sense of kind of background and understanding about where you came from. And so I think it's so interesting. Three out of our four kids are adopted. And so I love that I didn't know that about you, but I
no.
love that about you. And we try really hard to make sure that we stay in touch with biological members of their families so that we don't lose those pieces in that connection. And so they always have that part of this is that piece of where I came from. So I love that. I think that's a really powerful story and love that you were able to find your mom and get a few answers, but definitely can see why that would push you towards an interest in legacy planning for sure.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
wonderful.
So, talk to us to change gears just a little bit. So, clients who are they don't know anything about really estate planning. They feel nervous, they feel overwhelmed. If they're ready to get started, what does the process of working with you look like? How does that process go? What is the flow of things? How many meetings do they need to have? What does that look like?
Yeah. So when I started, I had this philosophy of, I didn't want my relationship with the clients to be a transaction. It just seemed wrong to me to just like take somebody on, create a bunch of documents for them and say goodbye, right? In fact, I never drafted, completion or disengagement letters for my clients. I just didn't because I always felt like I wanted them to feel like they could always call me and say, hey, this changed or that changed, or what do we do about this or that, or, so I wanted it to be more of a process or actually a relationship, right? I kind of wanted to be their lawyers for life. Well, I stumbled upon these folks at a wealth counsel symposium a couple years ago called the Personal Family Lawyer Network, and talking to the at the conference, and I kind of joined up with them or whatever, and they have the exact same philosophy of, lawyering in estate planning shouldn't be a transaction. It should be a relationship. And part of their mantra is keeping your family out of court and out of conflict, right? So they work from the premise of, you should be thinking about the people you're leaving behind, right? The planning's not for you. It's for those folks you're leaving behind. And just another quick story or whatever, right? My first wife's father, so my previous father-in-law, one of six kids or whatever, and his mom passes away and he has to go to the probate court. And this is in South Florida, I don't know, 20 years ago or whatever. But the only asset was her home. And so, she didn't die intestate. She had a will. The will was to sell the house and divide up the money between the six kids. It took him 23 months to probate that, right? And that seemed like awful to me. Like, why did it take so long? And why was it such an egregious amount of time
Right.
to just to sell a home? And like he had to go through a hurricane season without insurance on it because they couldn't, there was some glitch somewhere and they couldn't get insurance on the property because, there this, that, and the other
Somebody
thing.
wasn't living there, or yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I just that was just awful. And I'm thinking that shouldn't happen, right?
Right.
Well, obviously we have ways to keep those kind of things from happening or whatever, right? And then by her having put that property into an RLT before she passed away, there would have been nothing, right?
Right.
Though they wouldn't have suffered through that. And I don't remember how much he spent, but it was more than $10,000. And we're talking about in the 80s, right? So that,
Right.
it's just a lot of money.
Astronomical, right.
Yeah. And those are the kind of things that I think as a member of this network and that I want to deliver, and lawyers all across the country, and things that like something happens to me. I don't know how long I'm going to practice law. I really, really like practicing law. So I don't intend to quit anytime soon. I'm 58 years old, but I don't really intend to quit anytime soon. But when something happens to me, there will be people that have the same philosophy to me that we can pick up the baton, and my clients are never going to suffer. They're not going to be left in the cold, right? So it's a really good process, and we really care about our clients, and
I
so.
love that. I think that's great. So now that you've been doing this for a while, and I love the unique career path that you took kind of getting here, what is the biggest mistake that you see clients make? What is something that you see over and over? If you could tell someone who hasn't gotten started in this process, what is a big mistake that you wish you could warn people against?
Other than procrastinating, looking for the cheapest option,
Mm,
right? And we're lawyers and we all think that we do it better than anybody else. But the reality is that the online services are just giving you documents without any counsel. And it turns out bad. I've seen it. Like clients have come into my office with them, and luckily, before anything bad has happened, and I can help them fix those problems. But I've also probated, you know, LegalZoom documents.
right,
And the reason why we're probating LegalZoom trusts is because they didn't work.
right,
And that's why I want to keep your family out of court and out of conflict, right?
right.
So,
Right. We have seen the exact same thing in
yeah.
our law office, and we've actually seen it a lot kind of in our area where people have gone online, gotten a set of documents, they thought they had everything covered, they kind of checked the box, and then there they are in our office because their documents actually didn't work when tested, and they do end up in probate court, and kind of nothing went according to plan. Whereas if they had just gotten that plan reviewed by an estate planning attorney, it would have been so simple and easy. I always try to explain to clients, I'm sure you do this too. It's so easy on the front end to make the plan, fund everything, and you can kind of breathe easier versus trying to fix things on the back end. And so I 100% agree with that advice. And that's certainly one thing we see all of our clients, a mistake they make as well, is getting some quick documents for 500 bucks online and thinking they've got the box checked. And then they end up upset in our office. And now the hole's even deeper because they've got to go back and fix it. So I
And
agree with that
and
100%.
just as a side note, I've not had a client yet that when I ask them, is your plan to make it as hard as possible for, to be behind? Nobody's answered yes to that question.
Right, right. That's so true. That is so true. Oh, goodness. Okay. So if you could give our listeners one piece of advice, what would that be?
It would be to get your estate house in order
Yeah.
because you never know what's going to happen. I think it was in Colorado just this week. Husband, wife, family traveling somewhere. I don't remember the exact details of it, but it came across my news feed. Husband, wife killed in a car accident, young children left, right?
Yeah.
you
Right.
know and one of the other things that we do is, or I do anyway, and our network does, is provide kids protection plans, right?
Hmm.
So who's going to be there for your kids when they're with the babysitter and you don't come home, right? What's
Right.
going to happen to them? Do they end up in somebody's stranger's house? Do you have a document that says your next door neighbors then can watch those kids, right? I
Right.
mean, what do you got? What do you have?
Right. That happened to us. Our three adopted kiddos were adopted because something happened to my brother and sister-in-law. And if they'd had any sort of planning and we'd had any sort of documents, it would have been simple as walking up to get them and we'd be done. But they didn't have any of that planning done. And so we had to go before a judge and get
Yep.
temporary guardianship paperwork. And then we had to go back and get permanent guardianship paperwork. And something that would have been so easy on the front end ended up costing my husband and me about $15,000, which is
Yep.
wild. Plus, then we've got three new kids in our house, right? And so I love that you and your website talks about that, the guardianship and the plan for the kids. I think if our listeners hear anything, it's that if you have kids, young kids under the age of 18, get with Jay and bare minimum get a kids protection plan done. Your kids are already going through enough. The last thing that they need to be is getting hauled back and forth to court or God forbid end up, in foster care or with some other person in the family while you get your stuff in order. So
I mean,
I love the idea of the kids protection plan.
and that's the worst part, right? If they're young enough and they end up in some stranger's house, and
Yeah,
not saying that the foster people are bad people. That's not what I'm
right.
saying. I'm
For
saying
sure.
that's just a traumatic move for a child that's,
Right.
3, 4 years old,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, and even older kids, ours were anywhere, one early teen and then a couple of older elementary age kids. And the whole process, they're already overwhelmed with all these different emotions and new people. And then on top of that, we have court dates and paperwork and Uncle Blake and Aunt Katie Beth are stressed about documents and funding and all of these different things. And so I love the kids protection plan and think that's such an essential piece. If you've got young kids, that's an essential piece of every estate plan that needs to be taken care of.
Can
So
I give one
I
more
love,
advice? Can I give you one
yes,
more?
yes, I'm here for the free. Don't
Fund
charge me extra. I'm here for the free advice.
fund your trust.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Tell our listeners, say it again for the people in the back.
Fund your trust.
Fund your trust. If you don't do that, guys, it's your plan. Your
I
plan will not be really complete until you've done that. Yeah,
Right.
we have
I don't
to
let them.
we have to
I actually don't even let my clients do it themselves anymore. I've
yeah.
gone to the extreme of mother henning them and doing it. I do charge them, but
Yeah.
that's part of the deal of working with me is that when you're done, it's done right.
Right.
That's the bottom line. It's your trust is funded. It has no chance of failure, or I have minimized it to the absolute minuscule amount. So.
Yes. No, no. Two really great pieces of free advice for our listeners. So be sure you guys are getting those things done. And if you want more information on those things, we are about to tell you how to get in touch with Jay and get that done. So, final question before we sign off. through all of the work that you're doing with legacy planning and with the family lawyer network and, with creating all of these trusts and guardianship paperwork and all of this, what is it you hope your legacy will be?
That's a tough one.
It is.
Just that I didn't try to take advantage of anyone and I was here to help people, right? I mean, I have always lived by a bit of a golden rule. I'm not a very religious person, but I want to be treated, I want to treat people like I would want to be treated. That's always how
Right.
I've acted, right?
Right.
And if somebody could say that about me when I'm gone, then I've done it well. I've done it well. So
I love it. Great answer. Well, thank you to all of our listeners for joining us. We had such a great time on the show today. If you are interested in getting connected with Jay, you can visit jamespbarrettlaw.com. We will link that in the show notes for you. And be sure to check out his website. There are also some really great articles available there that you guys are going to find very, very interesting. So we will link all of that in the show notes for you. And Jay, thank you again so much for being on the podcast.
no, it was great, Kitty Beth. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller. For more information on them and the show, please visit pinnaclelegacylaw.com. If you like what you've learned today, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.